On the vast stage of history, deep-seated tensions have shaped the relationship between Iran and Israel, going well beyond territorial disputes. What truly lies behind this animosity? To understand, we must go back in time to the ancient lands of Elam, where the descendants of Shem once lived. Over the centuries, this territory was transformed, and Aryan influence began to intensify. But this isn't merely a story of conquests and battles. It is a narrative rooted in spiritual forces that continue to operate today. The scriptures speak of a prince of the Persian kingdom, an entity which, according to the book of Daniel, sought to prevent the liberation of the people of Israel. What does this mean for the modern struggle? Why does this hostility persist and intensify? The answers may be deeper than we imagine, revealing a conflict that transcends the physical realm, reaching into the spiritual. As we explore these roots, I invite you to reflect. What truly fuels this rivalry? And how do ancient stories shape the present? Prepare for a journey that might change your perspective. The conflict between Iran and Israel didn't emerge from nowhere. Its roots are embedded in a long history dating back to ancient times. To understand this troubled relationship, we must look at the civilization of Elam, which existed in the region now known as southwestern Iran. This civilization, which flourished more than 3,000 years ago, had trade and cultural ties with neighboring communities, including those in what is now Israel. Although Elam has vanished, the tensions between its cultural heritage and those that emerged later shaped the landscape where animosity could take root. Over the centuries, the social and political dynamics in the region changed. Various empires, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, interacted with the peoples of the area, fostering both alliances and hostilities. The influence of external powers, like Greece and Rome, also cannot be ignored. These interactions created an atmosphere of distrust and rivalry that endured through generations. What we see is that each new player in the region added another layer of complexity to the already intricate relationship between these populations. The Arab invasion in the 7th century and the subsequent spread of Islam also had a significant impact on relations between these two nations. Iran, which already had its own cultural and religious identity, came to view the new conquerors ambivalently, sometimes as oppressors, sometimes as agents of change. The emergence of Islam brought a new narrative that, in some cases, reinforced divisions between these peoples, especially regarding questions of identity and loyalty. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 marked a turning point that intensified these divisions. Iran became a theocratic state that openly opposed Israel, solidifying a sentiment of hostility that took root in the national narratives of both countries. The new Iranian government not only rejected the legitimacy of the Israeli state, but also used this antagonism to unite the Iranian people under a common cause, emphasizing the struggle against the Zionist enemy. Thus, the historical roots of the conflict between Iran and Israel are not merely a product of isolated events, but a rich and complex tapestry woven over millennia. Through wars, conquests, and social changes, a fertile ground has formed for the hatred and distrust that persists to this day. The demographic transformation that has occurred throughout Iran's history is a crucial piece in understanding the country's cultural and religious identity. Initially, the region was inhabited by Semitic peoples who established cultural and social ties with other civilizations nearby. These people were fundamental to the development of the first cities and cultures in the area. Over time, the invasion by Aryan peoples brought significant changes to the demographic makeup and local culture. The Aryans, who migrated to the region, brought new traditions, languages, and beliefs. This blending of Semitic and Aryan cultures shaped Iranian identity in ways that are still felt today. The interaction between these groups was not without conflict, but also resulted in cultural exchanges and syncretisms that enriched the region's history. The outcome was a multifaceted identity that over time became a source of pride, but also of division. In the context of the Iran-Israel relationship, this demographic transformation is relevant because it created an environment where different historical and cultural narratives can coexist, yet often in tension. The descendants of Semitic peoples, who today primarily identify with Israel, view the history of their land in a way that differs greatly from the Iranians, who carry the marks of Aryan influence. This difference in perspectives is reflected in the attitudes and policies of both countries. Moreover, the cultural and religious identity that developed in Iran after the Aryan invasion influenced how Iranians perceive Israel. Persian culture, rich in traditions and history, often positions itself in opposition to the Israeli narrative, creating an ideological battleground that goes beyond territorial disputes. This dynamic has helped perpetuate a cycle of hostility and distrust. Thus, the demographic transformation in Iran, marked by the interaction between Semitic and Aryan peoples, is an essential factor in understanding the animosity between Iran and Israel. The identities that emerged from this complex history continue to shape the relations between the two countries, contributing to the persistence of the conflict. The biblical perspective. When discussing the hostility between Israel and neighboring nations, the Bible is a rich source of references that help shed light on this dynamic. The Old Testament, for example, often mentions the rivalry between Israel and other nations, including direct references to relations with the Persians. For many, these passages are not merely historical accounts, but hold a deeper spiritual significance that continues to resonate in modern relations. One of the most frequently cited texts is the Book of Daniel, which mentions the prince of the Persian kingdom. This figure is often interpreted as a symbol of spiritual forces influencing events on earth. For many theologians and scholars, this passage suggests that hostility between Israel and neighboring nations is not merely a political issue, but also a spiritual conflict. This view can intensify resentment and distrust between peoples, as many believe they are fighting not only for territory, but also for a divine cause. Moreover, the interpretation of these biblical passages varies widely across different religious traditions. While Jews may see these stories as a confirmation of their own historical narrative, Iranians, especially under the influence of Islam, may view the same stories in a way that reinforces their role as defenders of faith against God's enemies. This type of interpretation can fuel the cycle of hostility, perpetuating the idea that the struggle is a matter of spiritual survival. Biblical references also play a significant role in constructing the national identity of both countries. In Israel, biblical history is often used to legitimize the people's presence in the land, while in Iran, these narratives can be reinterpreted to justify opposition to the Israeli state. Thus, the biblical perspective not only shapes historical understanding, but also influences contemporary narratives that fuel the conflict. In summary, an examination of the biblical perspective on the hostility between Israel and neighboring nations reveals complex layers of meaning that extend beyond politics. These interpretations shape how both sides view not only themselves but also each other, perpetuating a cycle of distrust and hostility that is difficult to break. Spiritual and demonic forces. In the context of relations between Iran and Israel, the notion of spiritual and demonic forces takes on particular significance. Many believe that an invisible battle is unfolding in spiritual realms, reflected in the tensions and conflicts between these nations. Beyond political and territorial issues, religious traditions in both Iran and Israel often associate conflicts with malevolent influences. This perspective suggests that these conflicts are not only the result of human disputes, but also of supernatural forces that instigate hatred and distrust among peoples. Within the Islamic context, the belief in jinn, spiritual beings that can be either benevolent or malevolent, is quite relevant. Some interpretations suggest that demonic jinn may incite discord and violence. Thus, the hostility between Iran and Israel is often viewed as a manifestation of a larger battle between good and evil, where malevolent forces are attempting to destabilize the peace and harmony that religious traditions seek. This spiritualized view of the conflict gives these disputes a sense of urgency and importance, legitimizing hostile actions under the justification of combating evil. On the other hand, in Israel, the narrative is also imbued with a spiritual view of the conflict. Many see the struggle for the Promised Land as part of a divine plan, where demonic forces attempt to delegitimize Jewish presence in the region. This belief intertwines with religious traditions that speak of a constant fight for survival against enemies perceived as instruments of evil. Thus, spiritual forces are used to justify and reinforce resistance against what is considered an existential threat. Theological interpretations that view the conflict as part of a spiritual battle have direct implications on the attitudes and behaviors of the faithful. In Iran, the idea of a divine destiny that justifies hostility towards Israel is often promoted by religious and political leaders. This creates an atmosphere of religious fervor, where the struggle against Israel is seen as a spiritual obligation. Messages circulated in sermons and media are laden with symbolism that reinforces this connection between the conflict and spiritual forces. Finally, this link between spiritual forces and terrible conflicts is not limited to Israel and Iran, but extends to many other areas of tension worldwide. Religious and spiritual narratives shape people's perceptions and responses, perpetuating a cycle of hostility fueled by both material and spiritual factors. This complex dynamic makes the path to peace even more challenging, as the roots of hatred are seen as deep and often supernatural. The role of theology in hatred theology plays a crucial role in the relations between Iran and Israel, shaping how these two nations view and relate to each other. Religious interpretations, which vary widely among different denominations and groups, influence the narrative of the conflict. In Iran, the dominant Shia theology emphasizes the fight against what is perceived as oppression, with Israel often viewed as the personification of that oppression. This theological perspective is not merely a personal belief, but a social construct that permeates the country's power and political structures. Religious leaders in Iran often invoke theology as a justification for their actions. The notion that the struggle against Israel is part of a divine destiny is a powerful narrative that resonates with many. This not only legitimizes hostilities, but also galvanizes popular support, creating a sense of unity around a higher purpose. Theological interpretations that view this struggle as a sacred duty make any move towards reconciliation difficult, as hostility is seen as a spiritual requirement. In Israel, on the other hand, theology also plays a significant role. The Jewish people often refer to sacred texts that speak of the Promised Land and the struggle for survival. This theological view is reinforced by religious and political leaders who use the biblical narrative to justify Israel's presence in the region. The idea that Israel has a divine right to the land promotes a sense of legitimacy, making it difficult for many Israelis to accept any form of territorial concession. The differing theological interpretations between the two nations create a chasm that seems insurmountable. Instead of promoting dialogue, these doctrines tend to solidify divisions, leading to a worldview where each side sees the other as a justified enemy. This results not only in hostility, but also in a lack of mutual understanding, where the core beliefs and values of each side are disregarded or vilified. Thus, theology is not merely a factor influencing attitudes, but a central component that shapes each side's national identity and perception of legitimacy. This intersection between religion and politics complicates conflict resolution, as any attempt at dialogue must address not only political issues, but also the deep theological convictions that sustain the hatred. The message that resonates in both societies is that the struggle is not merely for territory, but for a cause perceived as sacred and, therefore, non-negotiable. Modern political conflicts. The connection between the historical and spiritual roots of hatred between Iran and Israel becomes even clearer when analyzing modern political conflicts. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 in Iran brought about a radical shift in the political and social dynamics of the region. The new leadership, under Ayatollah Khomeini, not only rejected the friendly relationship that Iran once maintained with Israel, but also adopted an aggressive stance toward the Jewish state. This shift was driven by a combination of historical, theological, and political factors that became interwoven. The Islamic Revolution, in establishing a theocratic republic, redefined Iranian identity around a narrative of resistance. Israel, seen as an ally of the United States and a symbol of Western imperialism, became an easy target for revolutionary rhetoric. The new leadership used hostility toward Israel as a means to consolidate internal power and mobilize the population around a common cause. This strategy was effective, creating a sense of unity among different factions within Iranian society, even in a context of ethnic and religious diversity. Contemporary political conflicts, including the war in Lebanon and the crisis in Syria, also exacerbate tensions between Iran and Israel. Iran's involvement in proxy wars in the region, supporting groups like Hezbollah, intensifies the perception of threat in Israel. For Israelis, the Iranian military presence at the borders is seen as a red line that cannot be crossed. This generates a military response that in turn fuels a cycle of violence and retaliation, deepening the rift between the two nations. Furthermore, the regional rivalry between Iran and Israel is amplified by broader geopolitical interests. The struggle for control over resources, influence over neighboring Arab states, and competition for leadership in the Islamic world make the situation even more complex. Western powers, including the United States, also play a significant role, often supporting Israel at Iran's expense. This external dynamic adds layers of complication to the already tense relationship between the two countries. In this context, the historical and spiritual roots of hatred are often overlooked in modern political analyses. However, it is essential to recognize that contemporary conflicts cannot be fully understood without considering the long history of hostility and mistrust that has shaped relations between Iran and Israel. The duality between political motivations and spiritual beliefs remains a determining factor in perpetuating this conflict, making any lasting solution a monumental task. National narratives and identity. The hatred between Iran and Israel has intertwined so deeply within the national narratives of both countries that it has become almost impossible to separate it from their cultural identities. In Iran, the narrative often emphasizes resistance against oppression and the struggle for sovereignty, using the image of Israel as a symbol of Western imperialism. This narrative construction is fueled by historical events such as the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which transformed the perception of the Israeli state from that of a neighbor to an enemy. In classrooms, young Iranians learn about this hostility as part of their national education, solidifying the idea that Iran must oppose Israel in the name of justice and dignity. In Israel, on the other hand, The national narrative also draws from this antagonism. The Jewish people's history, marked by persecution and diaspora, leads many Israelis to view Iran as an existential threat. This perception is reinforced by the hostile rhetoric of the Iranian regime, which often denies Israel's right to exist. As a result, Israeli education and popular culture depict Iran as an adversary, which in turn rallies the population around an identity rooted in defense and resilience. This dynamic creates a vicious cycle in which each side feeds the other's hatred. Moreover, national narratives are often used as tools of propaganda. Leaders in both countries, in times of crisis, turn to these stories of hostility to unite their populations around a common enemy. This strategy not only diverts attention from internal issues, but also solidifies national loyalty. Thus, the hatred between Iran and Israel becomes a fundamental component of national identity, perpetuating a cycle of mistrust and animosity. Popular culture also plays a crucial role in this process. Films, music, and literature in both countries often depict the rivalry in ways that reinforce stereotypes and prejudices. In Iran, for example, cinema frequently portrays Israel as an oppressor, while in Israel, the media may depict Iran as a fanatical and dangerous regime. These representations shape public opinion, creating a distorted view of the other, which in turn fuels hatred. Finally, this relationship between national narratives and identity is not limited to political discourse. It extends to social relationships and influences how the populations see themselves and interact with the world. The hatred between Iran and Israel, rooted in historical and cultural narratives, ultimately defines who these people are and how they interact, not only with each other, but also with the rest of the international community. The perpetuation of these narratives makes reconciliation even more difficult, creating a scenario where dialogue and understanding seem increasingly distant. Reflections on spiritual and territorial conflicts. The intersection of spiritual and territorial hostility is a fundamental aspect of the conflict between Iran and Israel, bringing to light deep questions about the nature of hatred and its implications for peace. In many cases, the perception that the struggle is not only territorial but also spiritual complicates efforts to resolve the conflict. For many Iranians, hostility towards Israel is seen as a sacred struggle, a defense not only of the land but also of Islamic faith. This narrative spiritualizes the conflict, making it more difficult to resolve, as it involves questions of identity and belief that go beyond politics. In Israel, conversely, the spiritual connection to the land is equally intense. For the Jewish people, the land of Israel is considered sacred, and the struggle for its defense is often viewed through the lens of a divine mission. This perspective spiritualizes Israeli resistance, presenting it as a struggle for survival and the fulfillment of a historical destiny. Thus, both Iranians and Israelis see their causes as just and worthy, making the path to reconciliation even more challenging. This spiritual and territorial dynamic also manifests in how each side perceives the other. Iranians often see Israel as an embodiment of Western imperialism, a force seeking to destabilize not only the region, but also Islamic faith. Conversely, Israelis perceive Iran as a threat to their right to exist, associating it with radicalism that challenges not only their security, but also their values. This worldview, rooted in spiritual and territorial concepts, continues to fuel the cycle of hostility. Moreover, the implications of such conflicts extend beyond the battlefield. Tensions between Iran and Israel have significant repercussions for peace and stability in the region. Neighboring countries often find themselves forced to choose sides, which can further deepen divisions and rivalries. The fear of escalating conflict creates an atmosphere of distrust that permeates international relations in the region, complicating mediation and dialogue efforts. Reflecting on these spiritual and territorial conflicts is essential for any approach aimed at peace. Recognizing that hatred between Iran and Israel is fueled by both political and spiritual issues is the first step in understanding the complexity of the situation. Without this recognition, any attempt at resolution may be limited to superficial solutions that do not address the deeper roots of the problem. Peace will not be achieved solely through treaties or negotiations. A genuine effort will be required to dismantle the narratives that perpetuate hatred and seek a deeper understanding between these two nations. As we dive into the depths of history and spirituality, it is impossible to ignore the lasting impact that these forces have on these nations to this day. The hatred between Iran and Israel goes beyond territorial disputes. It is a conflict that echoes through the centuries, rooted in issues that transcend the human realm. Have you ever considered how these historical ties shape the present? Scripture warns us about the spiritual battle at play, showing that what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. The prince of the Persian kingdom, mentioned in Daniel, serves as a reminder that invisible forces are always present, influencing war and peace. What does this mean for us today? How can we understand this enmity in light of faith and history? We invite you to reflect on these profound questions. What do you think can be done to pursue peace between these nations? What lessons can we learn from this ancient rivalry? Share your thoughts in the comments and continue exploring this fascinating topic on our channel. The journey for truth and understanding is just beginning.